The Galactic Council had never been so silent. In a chamber the size of a mountain, filled with hundreds of floating translator drones and holographic screens flickering with the faces of delegates from 51 alien civilizations, not a single voice spoke as the final vote was called. At the center of it all stood Counselor Threx of the Molari Trium, tall and crystalline, with veins of glowing blue light pulsing beneath his transparent skin. He raised one long finger to the sky, signaling the final decision. His voice echoed across the chamber, translated into hundreds of languages at once, yet all delivered the same message: by the authority of this united council, the human species is hereby banned from all interstellar trade, alliances, and technology-sharing agreements. Effective immediately. The words hit like a shockwave. Some delegates nodded in agreement, others exchanged nervous glances, but none objected. It had taken years to reach this moment. Years of complaints from frontier colonies about humans moving too fast, pushing boundaries, making allies in unlikely places. Years of quiet frustration that humans, newcomers to the stars, had achieved in a few decades what most species took centuries to accomplish. They had settled over 100 planets, not by conquest, but by adaptability. They traded fairly, they taught generously, and they asked dangerous questions. Questions that made the Council uncomfortable. Why should technology be restricted? Why should knowledge be controlled? Why shouldn't weaker species be helped to rise? The Council had tolerated them for a while, amused by their ambition and stubborn optimism. But as human influence spread, the Council grew uneasy. Small species once ignored by the galactic powers were suddenly thriving, their cultures blending with Terran ideas, their economies growing under human guidance. Even worse, some had begun to reject Council regulations entirely, calling them outdated and biased. The humans had never declared war. They had no empire, no fleet of conquerors. What they had was a movement, and that made them harder to stop. The Council believed that banning them now, cutting them off from the rest of the galaxy, would stop the spread. They believed that without access to trade, without permission to engage, the humans would be isolated and, eventually, forgotten. But far from Earth, in shadowed corners of space, a different story was already unfolding. On the outer rim of the Veltrax sector, a small mining colony named Drella 7 had received news of the ban hours ago. Instead of worry, its inhabitants, none of them human, had gathered in the main square and raised a flag designed by their human mentor 5 years earlier. A simple white banner with a golden arc. It was not a human flag, not officially. But to them, it meant unity, hope, and the future. On the trade world of Kalsura, where human engineers had helped rebuild failing infrastructure and taught advanced farming techniques to desert dwellers, protests broke out in front of the Council's embassy. Peaceful, quiet, but firm. A single phrase repeated across hand-drawn signs: "We do not forget who helped us rise." Even on Council-controlled worlds, murmurs of doubt began to spread. Delegates who had once laughed at human enthusiasm now wondered if they had made a mistake. But the ban was passed. Official. Locked into law by the highest authority in the galaxy. The humans, for their part, said nothing. Earth's official response was one of calm acknowledgement. Their ambassador to the Council, Maria Cheng, simply packed her belongings, left the chamber, and boarded a sleek shuttle back toward Seoul. No protest. No resistance. Just silence. And that silence was more unsettling than any threat. Because those who knew humans best understood that they rarely made noise before acting. They planned. They adapted. And once they moved, they did not stop. In the days following the vote, Council ships were dispatched to monitor known human trade routes. Most were empty. Others showed signs of recent activity: ships launched, data cores wiped, long-distance signals silenced. It was as if the humans had anticipated the decision and already shifted elsewhere. But where? That question burned in the minds of every Council strategist. The humans were no longer just spreading across space. They were disappearing into it. Fading from monitored sectors, slipping past patrol lines, their presence harder and harder to track. And yet, strange things began to happen. Entire planets, once underdeveloped, began to flourish overnight with advanced power grids and clean water systems, all using modified human designs. Ancient satellites from long-dead worlds blinked back to life, beaming education files and Terran standard across systems that had never known Earth. On a barren moon in the Miry Belt, explorers found a library carved into the rock, filled with holograms of human scientists explaining everything from mathematics to starship repair in 57 languages. The Council scrambled to contain it, but every time they shut down one signal, 3 more appeared elsewhere. Humanity had gone underground. Or maybe above. No one was sure anymore. What was clear was that banning them had not stopped them. If anything, it had changed them from active participants to mythic catalysts. The kind of force you couldn't predict or control. Councillor Threx, who had led the vote, now found himself lying awake each night, wondering if history would remember him as a defender of order or the one who sparked its collapse. He wasn't sure anymore. Somewhere in the uncharted edges of the galaxy, a small vessel glided silently past a council drone. Inside it, a human captain smiled as she watched a young alien species activate their first planetary AIA gift disguised as salvage. She tapped a note into her log. The vote went through. They think it's over. Good. That means we're right on time. Far from the polished chambers of the Galactic Council, beyond the regulated sectors and the tightly patrolled space lanes, the consequences of the human ban had already begun to unfold in quiet, subtle ways that no one in power had anticipated. While Council officials celebrated their decision, believing they had cut humanity off from influence, they failed to notice the way human ideas had already taken root across hundreds of systems. On the dusty plains of Lorvan, a farming colony once written off as unviable by Council standards was now producing double the usual yield, thanks to a group of Terran agriculturalists who had taught the locals to adapt Earth's crop rotation methods to their alien soil. Those humans were long gone, vanished before the Council's patrols arrived, but the irrigation systems they built still ran, and the children in the village still studied from learning tablets, with Earth symbol etched discreetly in the corner. Across the Indari Reach, a merchant station operated entirely by the insectoid species known as the Qatari had begun to adopt strange new management systems, more efficient, fairer to workers, and modeled almost exactly on human corporate frameworks. None of it was illegal, technically, but it showed one troubling fact. Human presence was no longer physical. It was cultural, intellectual, and spreading like wind over water. Even worse for the Council, many of these species had no intention of stopping. They saw the human teachings not as control but as empowerment, a gift that had allowed them to rise from dependency to self-rule. To them, the ban was not just an insult to humans, but to every civilization that had worked side by side with them, learned from them, and grown because of them. In hidden meetings and encrypted communications, these species began forming alliances of their own, not military, but cooperative, in nature, designed to share knowledge, protect each other's sovereignty, and preserve what they called the Terran way. On the surface, it looked like innocent partnership agreements, harmless cultural exchanges, but underneath, it was something more, a quiet, organized response to a galaxy that had turned its back on the force that had once extended a hand. The Council tried to control the flow of Terran influence by scanning data channels, shutting down suspected relay points, and blacklisting entire trade hubs, but they were always 2 steps behind. For every hidden archive they wiped, another 10 appeared in distant sectors, uploaded by unknown sources. Human languages began slipping into daily speech across colonies that had never even seen Earth. Phrases like "stay curious" or "build forward" became common among students, engineers, and young leaders. The ideas were simple but powerful: solve problems, question limits, help others rise with you. They were dangerous not because they threatened violence, but because they inspired change. One Council operative stationed in the Mid-Rim region submitted a report describing a colony that had built its entire education system around human-inspired values, creativity, resilience, and shared learning. The report was marked classified and ignored, but within the Council, cracks were beginning to form. Some delegates, particularly from the younger species, began asking quiet questions. Why had the humans really been banned? Was it because they broke rules, or because they broke the old balance of power? Not all species had benefited from the human presence, of course. Some had lost trade dominance, others felt threatened by the loss of their technological advantage, but none could deny the results. Worlds that had once relied on council aid now stood on their own, thriving under systems developed in partnership with Earth. And Earth itself? Silent, invisible, and completely outside the reach of the council. Their ships no longer answered calls, their embassies stood abandoned, and their diplomats had vanished without protest. Yet somehow, their legacy remained. It was whispered that humans had left behind something far more lasting than ships or soldiers. They had left behind ideas, and those could not be banned. On the ocean world of Thaler Prime, where aquatic species once struggled with communication devices, an entire new language interface system had been built using principles taught by a Terran linguist named Dr. Ava Line. She had disappeared 2 years ago, but her students had continued her work, spreading it across their sector. In the mining tunnels of Grylos, miners still used modified Earth exosuits to dig deeper and safer than ever before. No one admitted where the suits came from, but they wore them proudly, each one etched with a small insignia shaped like an open hand. The council couldn't prove anything, but they knew humans had prepared for this. They had seen the ban coming, and rather than fight it, they had simply stepped aside and let the seeds they planted grow. In the shadows, a small network of unknown signals moved through deep space relays, bouncing across dead satellites and forgotten way stations. No one knew who was controlling them, but the pattern was clear. These were not military orders. These were instructions, blueprints, messages of encouragement and guidance written in human tone, but meant for non-human eyes. One transmission found by accident in the Siren Drift read simply, "If they silence our voices, let our actions speak. You are ready. The future is yours now. Build it well." When the council reviewed this, some laughed, calling it a dramatic gesture. Others stayed quiet, wondering if the humans were no longer acting as participants in the galaxy's affairs, but as mentors preparing the next generation to take over. One of the oldest council members, a serpent-like being from the Nathari race, spoke quietly in a closed session. "Perhaps we didn't exile them. Perhaps they left us behind." No one replied, but the silence was loud. And somewhere, in a deep, quiet corner of the galaxy, an unmarked ship entered orbit over a forgotten planet, where a group of young beings from 5 different species stood waiting. The hatch opened slowly, and a human stepped out, not with weapons or banners, but with a datapad and a simple smile. "Let's begin," she said. The next chapter of the galaxy had already started. In the cold silence of deep space, far from the brightly lit systems controlled by the Galactic Council, something moved quietly through the void, something large, deliberate, and unseen by any official scanners. It was not a single ship, but a network of vessels spread across forgotten routes and hidden jump points, moving without transponders, shields lowered to avoid detection, and hulls coated in sensor-absorbing material. This was the Shadow Fleet, a term not used by the humans who built it, but whispered in fragments by Council intelligence agents who couldn't prove it existed. They believed humanity had disappeared after the ban, hiding in shame or retreating to their homeworld, but they had misunderstood everything. The silence was not surrender, it was strategy. Even before the vote to ban them, humans had begun removing their presence from monitored regions, pulling back their diplomats, researchers, and merchants, not out of fear, but with purpose. The moment the Council pushed them out of the galactic spotlight, the ships in the Shadow Fleet were not built for war, though they could defend themselves if needed. They were sleek, modular vessels designed for adaptation colonization ships, disguised as cargo freighters, mobile laboratories that looked like old salvage rigs, and humanitarian transports masked as asteroid surveyors. Each one carried teams of specialist scientists, engineers, linguists, and educators who had volunteered to vanish from official records in order to keep humanity's true mission alive. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't raise flags, and they answered to no government. Their orders were simple: go where help was needed, build quietly, uplift the forgotten, and prepare the way for something greater. The Council, in its arrogance, thought the ban had ended human expansion, but it had only forced them to evolve into something more subtle and far-reaching. On a remote world in the Polarix Expanse, a dying colony received an unexpected delivery crates filled with advanced water purification tech, soil renewal systems, and a handwritten manual in 5 local dialects. No ship was seen arriving, but the night before, a star had flickered oddly above the colony, as if something massive had passed between them and the sky. Elsewhere, on a drifting station long abandoned by the Council, lights began to turn back on. Solar arrays realigned themselves, doors hissed open after years of silence, and in the central hub, a message pulsed in Terran Standard, "Welcome back. Let's rebuild." The Shadow Fleet didn't wait for permission. It moved with purpose, activating old alliances, revisiting forgotten outposts, and offering tools instead of commands. They didn't seek power, they seeded it in others. Council patrols searching for traces of human vessels found only confusion sensor logs, corrupted, trails that looped in circles, and witnesses who swore they'd seen nothing. Ships disguised as comets, drones that looked like space debris, and habitats hidden beneath the surfaces of moons all worked together to mask the presence of a fleet that was everywhere and nowhere at once. On a listening post near the neutral zone, a junior analyst intercepted a signal too complex to decode fully, but a fragment repeated itself in her headset. Soft and almost musical, shadow is not absence. Shadow is cover. Growth begins in the dark. When she brought it to her superior, he dismissed it as nonsense. But in her heart, she wasn't sure. Somewhere, in the blackness between stars, someone was planning something far bigger than the Council imagined. On the command deck of the vessel Lumen's Reach, drifting in the shadow of a gas giant, Captain Elias Rain studied a map filled not with borders, but with needs planets suffering from drought, species facing extinction, children who had never known freedom from war. Around him, his crew worked without fanfare, updating coordinates, analyzing requests, and organizing their next drop. These were not soldiers, they were healers, architects, thinkers, and each one knew they might never return home. But that was the price of legacy. Humanity had once believed they were just one voice among many in the galaxy. They were not conquerors, not rulers, but carriers of a fire too bright to be hidden. Even the Council, for all its power, could not stop an idea whose time had come. On the core worlds, rumors spread of colonies becoming independent, not through rebellion, but through quiet competence. Places once seen as too poor, too unstable, too primitive, now operated with systems no one could trace back to Earth, but everyone recognized the fingerprints. And still, the Shadow Fleet moved. It didn't answer calls, didn't claim victories, and didn't seek thanks. It moved like a whisper, like the breath before a storm, reshaping the galaxy one silent mission at a time. And while the Council debated policies and redrew star charts, the map of true influence shifted beneath their feet. The humans had not broken the Council's rules. They had simply outgrown them. And somewhere, in a hidden hangar built into the side of a forgotten asteroid, a group of young aliens gathered around a human hologram, watching a lesson on how to terraform their dying world. At the end of the video, the woman on the screen smiled and said, "The stars belong to those who reach for them. Now it's your turn." The ship orbiting overhead blinked once, then vanished into the dark dot, eye in the silent glow of dawn over the twin moons of Sereth Prime. Something unexpected stirred not the sound of warships or the flash of plasma fire, but the quiet movement of thousands of beings, standing side by side, from different species, different worlds, all facing the Council's outpost in the center of the city with eyes full of purpose. These were not soldiers. They were builders, healers, students, miners, and traders, ordinary people who had once lived under the rules of the Galactic Council without question. But everything had changed when the humans came. Not through orders or force, but through knowledge and hope. They had called it the Uplift Program, humans helping weaker or struggling species learn, grow, and stand on their own. The Council had called it interference. But to those who had been uplifted, it had been salvation. And now, as the band tried to erase the humans and their legacy, those who had once been helped were rising not to fight in the old sense, but to push back in a new way. On Sereth Prime, the crowd was not carrying weapons. They were carrying tools, books, datapads, banners that read "Knowledge is freedom," and we remember who helped. The council guards inside the outpost, confused and overwhelmed, could only watch as the people surrounded the building peacefully, cutting off power without damaging a single panel, jamming communications not with viruses, but with a flood of encrypted educational files, all based on Terran models. It was not an attack. It was a takeover of thought. In dozens of systems across the galaxy, similar uprisings were beginning, all without violence. On the jungle world of Dravalis, a youth-led council replaced their corrupt planetary governor by overwhelming the local network with a vote powered by a human-invented decentralized voting system. On the rocky world of Korath, workers took control of a collapsing energy grid using a redesigned blueprint left behind by Terran engineers. Even the sea dwellers of Nishuan formed their first land-based education center, guided by old messages from Earth's floating research vessels. These uprisings were not acts of war, they were acts of awakening. The beings who had once waited for council aid were no longer waiting. They were acting, building, solving problems, and sharing those solutions with one another. The council tried to shut it down. They labeled it illegal, dangerous, destabilizing. But it was too late. The humans had not just uplifted individuals, they had planted ideas. And ideas, once awakened, could not be unlearned. The Shadow Fleet, still hidden in deep space, watched all of it unfold with silent approval. Their job had never been to lead these people, only to light the path and then step away. Captain Elias Rain received a report from the edge of Council territory where an entire moon had declared independence not with weapons, but with a document of self-governance based on Terran principles. No violence, no bloodshed, just resolve. Rain smiled and sent a single message back. They've taken the torch. In the council chambers, panic began to grow. Reports came faster than they could be processed. Star systems were organizing without permission. Species once thought weak were now refusing resource deals, demanding equal treatment, and rewriting their own laws. None of them said they were loyal to humans, but every change had Terran influence buried in it. The council had never seen a revolution like this. There were no leaders to arrest, no armies to defeat, only ideas spreading faster than they could be contained. Behind closed doors, the oldest counselors argued that the humans had infected the galaxy with chaos. But the younger ones began to question whether it was chaos or justice long overdue. Counselor Threx, once the strongest voice in favor of the ban, now sat alone in his chambers, replaying a security recording from a mining colony that had refused council inspectors. In it, a young alien child stood with a human-made datapad in hand, calmly explaining their right to self-determination. There was no hate in the child's voice, only certainty. Threx had always believed that order brought peace, but now he wondered if that peace had only existed for the few. Across the stars, the quiet uprising continued not through fire and blood, but through minds lit with new thought. On an orbital station above Hulrose V, a school once operated by the Council reopened under new direction, its curriculum rebuilt from Terran archives. Teachers from 4 species stood together, explaining principles of critical thinking, collaboration, and invention. Students from different worlds sat side by side, not as rivals, but as equals. There was no anthem, no banner, just the quiet hum of learning. And far away, in a hidden observatory carved into the shell of a long-dead space whale, a human teacher watched the stars shift slowly overhead, her face calm as she recorded another lesson to be sent across untraceable relay beacons. "You do not need us anymore," she said into the camera, her voice soft. "You only need each other." That was always the goal. And then she pressed send, the signal vanishing into the black, where it would find its way to those who still believed in building something better. The uprising was no longer rising. It had arrived. The stars over the central worlds of the Galactic Council were steady and cold, shining the same as they always had. But something had shifted beneath their glow, something deep and irreversible. Whispers of change had grown into full voices, and the silent influence of humanity had turned into a wave too large to ignore. For the first time in centuries, the council chambers were nearly empty, not because the delegates were missing, but because their systems were now quiet, uncooperative, or fully independent. Meetings were delayed, proposals ignored, and votes rendered meaningless as entire planets refused to participate, citing their right to self-govern under a set of principles inspired not by council law, but by human ideals. It was then, in this moment of deep uncertainty, that the stars blinked in a way no one could explain, not natural, not random, but a clear signal. Across hundreds of systems, ships that had not been seen in years emerged from dark space, not in fleets of war, but in perfect, peaceful formations. They carried no flags, no demands, and no threats, only light, silence, and the unmistakable signature of Earth's lost vessels. From the dead rings of Foros Station to the mist-covered ports of Ellen's Reach, the Shadow Fleet revealed itself, not to conquer, but to return. One by one, the ships made contact, not with governments, but with the people. Messages played in local dialects, warm and respectful, offering not control, but conversation. "We left so you could find your voice," said one voice, transmitted through a hidden beacon on the moon of Carvena. "We return only to listen." On the ground, the reactions were mixed joy, disbelief, confusion, but not fear. Because by now, most of the galaxy had come to understand humanity's strength was never in domination, but in their refusal to give up on progress, even when pushed aside. The Council tried to act, but they had no power left. Their enforcement. Arms had been dismantled from within, their loyal systems now governed by councils formed from uplifted worlds, their networks flooded with information too rich to censor. On Earth, still quiet and distant, the lights of old cities glowed once again, not with celebration, but with readiness. For years, they had watched, waited, guided from the shadows, and now, when the galaxy finally stood, they stepped forward not as rulers, but as neighbors. In a surprise broadcast that reached every corner of known space, a single human stood before a simple backdrop, the open sky behind her, the Terran symbol on her sleeve worn and faded. "We never wanted control," she said calmly. "We only wanted to help you rise. You have done that. We don't return to lead. We return to walk beside you if you'll have us." Her words were met not with protests, but with silence, deep, thoughtful silence, followed by cheers in markets, nods in meeting halls, and tears on distant mining moons where human engineers had once risked their lives to fix systems long forgotten by the Council. The return was not loud. It did not shake the stars or burn through the sky. It was quiet, like the opening of a door long closed. Human ships docked in peace. Old friends reunited. Young leaders who had never met a human before found themselves in quiet conversations with the very people who had shaped their futures. And on the floor of the great chamber of the Council, only a few delegates remained, watching a new era begin not through war, but through will. The humans had been banned, erased, forgotten. But the ideas they planted had taken root so deeply that not even the oldest powers could cut them down. And now, with the galaxy reshaped, they had returned not to reclaim a place, but to offer one. In the academy halls of Thyrion's Spire, where young minds gathered from every species, a new mural was painted, an open hand reaching out across the stars, not to take, but to lift. And on the farthest edge of the known galaxy, where no council had ever reached, a small station flickered to life, powered by a reactor once dismissed as impossible. Above it, a Terran ship held position, silent but steady, watching the stars with a quiet certainty. The return was not about Earth. It was about what Earth had given: courage to ask questions, the freedom to choose one's future, and the belief that even the smallest spark could one day light a star. And so, the humans returned not to be praised, not to be feared, but to be present and to remind the galaxy of a truth it had almost forgotten, that once an idea is born, it cannot be banned, and once people rise, they do not fall again. The future was no longer in the hands of the old council, or even the humans it belonged to all who had chosen to rise. And as the ships of the Shadow Fleet quietly took their place among the stars, the galaxy, for the first time in memory, stood not divided but ready together,